Good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome on behalf of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and UN Volunteers to this online summit on gender and sustainable peace and development. My name is Catherine White. I'm a gender expert and gender advisor working at UNITAR, and I am so happy to be joined today by our four distinguished panelists. We have Victoria Dart, a gender-based violence specialist at UNFPA. We have Rina Alinen, who's a program officer at UNDP. We have Jiandira Iradi, who's a gender specialist and legal technical advisor. And we have Wanangwa Rachel Nganga, who's a gender program management and social development specialist. So we have quite the lineup today. And this is actually the second webinar in our gender series, which is a collaboration between UNITAR and UN Volunteers to really initiate conversations, and conversations that move beyond just talking and become a call to action. And they are really at our heart. We want them to be about the lived experiences of gender in reality. We actually dreamt this up last year during the heart of the coronavirus pandemic, where we just wanted to explore lessons we could learn from the women who were leading us through the pandemic, as well as other crisis and humanitarian situations. And today we have our second webinar, where we really want to build on that first conversation. So we have our incredible expert panelists, and they will bring to you an inclusive and an intersectional approach to gender. And they will share with us their own experiences and how they are working to advance global agendas on gender equality, on sustainable peace, and on development in fragile contexts. And just a little note to share with you as you're here joining us is that when we began planning for this webinar, we knew that we really wanted it to be part of a conversation, because how often do you attend a webinar and just hear people talking? And we really want this to be about something that can go beyond talking and initiate real transformative change. So please, as you're listening today, get inspired by what you're hearing. This is about shining a light on the incredible work that's being undertaken by many UN volunteers, but also by these four incredible panelists you see before you. And they are working every day to situate gender equality at the heart of all they do and build a better future for all. So, I mean, that's enough from me. You will hear much more from me later. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to allow our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. So I will ask first for Rina, if you could please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I have to begin by saying how overwhelming it is to see the amount of people we have participating. Thank you so much for joining. A warm virtual welcome to everyone. I'm Rina from Finland, and I serve at UNDP Egypt. I've been serving since a year and a half now. I started as a gender security training associate, and I currently serve as a program officer. As I have background in the Finnish Defense Forces, so in the military, that's actually where I first got introduced to the topic of gender and to the women, peace and security agenda during my service in peacekeeping as a uniformed military peacekeeper in southern Lebanon. I served as a gender focal point and understood the scope of gender work and the thematic. I'm joining today out of a genuine interest in, and some might even say passion of, gender. And I really look forward to hearing from my wonderful colleagues and hopefully having some beneficial inputs. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Rina. Great to have you here. Wanangwa, can I move to you, please, to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here, and I'm sure you're as excited as we are. I'm Wanangwa Rachel Nganga. I'm currently working as the Project Management Officer with the World Health Organization African Regional Office in Brazzaville, Congo. I've been with the UN Volunteers for a little over a year now. I initially started off with the UN Envoy's office in New York. I'm originally...
I think we've just lost Wanangwa's connection. I see she's joining back, but possibly while she's reconnecting. We have you here. Do you hear us, Wanangwa?
Yes, I do. I dropped off there. Yes, as I was saying, I have worked at the local, national, African region, and international levels. And that passion is exactly what made me want to join into the conversation today.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you and your experience with us. Next, Victoria, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Victoria Dard, as Catherine just mentioned. I am a gender-based violence specialist. I am Australian, but I'm currently based in Lao PDR with UNFPA. So I specialise in preventing and responding to gender-based violence, or GBV, and violence against women, as well as disability inclusion and mental health and psychosocial support. I have over 8 years experience in administering domestic human rights and anti-discrimination legislation, program implementation, policy development, and capacity building, particularly for and with government institutions. So I've worked predominantly in the Asia Pacific, so with UNFPA in Laos, UN Women in Bangladesh, and I was with the Australians National Human Rights Institute for many years. So I wanted to be involved in today's summit to highlight the linkages between ending GBV and achieving peace and development. You all likely know that ending GBV falls under SDG 5, and GBV is a major obstacle to the fulfillment of women and girls' human rights. And it happens in every single country in the world. It happens in developing countries, it happens in developed countries, it happens to women and girls of all nationalities, ages, religions, abilities, and men and boys also suffer as a result of the patriarchal systems and prevailing toxic masculinities. So in my view, if we reduce GBV, it's a benefit for everyone, and therefore a critical piece to achieving sustainable peace and development.
Thank you, Victoria. Cannot wait to hear more from you as we move through today's session. And last but not least, I would like to ask Yandira to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, good afternoon. I am very happy to be here and share this space with you. Well, as Catherine said, my name is Yandira Iradi. I'm from Bolivia. I'm a lawyer with more than 8 years in the field of gender violence prevention and the human trafficking and sexual exploitation crime. I have a master's degree in gender studies and an MBA, both careers in Spain. This year, I joined the governance and political participation team for UN Women Bolivia as a UNV for the legal assistance to work for the plan for women political rights. This plan was promoted by UNDP in coordination with UN Women and Bolivian State. During this electoral process, I was the main lawyer for the gender unit of the Supreme Electoral Court. I provide legal assistance to women victims of political violence. Currently, I'm in charge of shared management investigation. That means in Spanish, Acuerdos de Gestión Compartida. It is a whispered practice in political sphere in Bolivia. Well, I wanted to be part of this space with you because as a woman, as a professional, I wanted to share my experience in the political and participation field. I wanted to make it visible, the situation or the challenge that women have to face every day, and make it visible as well the situation of harassment and political violence. So that will be my passion, the reason I wanted to share this space with you. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Yandira. And I mean, I can see in the chat that people are responding very well to what's being said, and we have lots of UNVs, and it is worth mentioning, in case I didn't at the start, that all 4 of our panelists are also UNVs, as well as all of these other astonishing things that they're doing. So just wanted to make sure that that was very clear. Thank you for your introductions. I am really pleased to share that we're going to have 2 keynote addresses today, followed by an interactive chatting, questions, and then we'll move into some panel where you can also share your thoughts and ask questions to the panelists. So without further ado, I would like to invite Wanangwa Nganga to share her keynote address. Wanangwa will be talking on young women, passive victims versus active agents in building back better, how to move from rhetoric to action towards sustainable peace and development. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Hello to everyone again tuning in from around the world. I hope you're all safe and that you're keeping well in these times of the pandemic. Thank you to the United Nations Institute for Training and Research for organizing this very important event and for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I grew up in Malawi in a patriarchal society where the expectation often is that women will stay at home, bear children, and raise a family. As a family of 5 girls and 1 boy, it was really inevitable that my parents would receive a lot of social pressure into investing more in the son as opposed to the daughters. I feel extremely privileged and honored that my parents never treated us differently from my brother. But growing up, I was surprised to witness that young women were viewed as not having anything worthy to contribute into discussions, even when society was making specific decisions that would affect the lives of those young women. This was the genesis of my activism. And before, I really couldn't put it quite into words, but I knew that I wanted to change this social norm. I remember when I was in college, how a male colleague of mine asked me, why do you work so hard at your education? When in the end, you will just get married and your husband will take care of you. This reminded me of what Tsitsi Dangalembia describes in Nervous Conditions, of how Tambu complained to her father that the family was raising funds to send her brother to school and not her. And this is what he said. Can you cook books and feed them to your husband? Stay at home with your mother. Learn to cook, to clean, and to grow vegetables. And what is more, this is the same mentality that goes on into institutions, that women, and especially young women, do not have worthwhile contributions to make. But with a world population of close to 4 billion women and girls, we cannot ignore them. As countries across the globe are containing the spread and addressing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities have been exacerbated. Young women who are already living in dire situations, who are already affected by different forms of violence, emergencies, and limited access to essential and social services, have been disproportionately affected. And the progress that has been made on different development agendas, we have seen that it has been reversed. The statistics alone are disheartening. 1 in every 3 women alive today has either been beaten, coerced into sex, or abused in some way. 650 million girls and women were married as children, with an additional 10 million that are at risk of child marriages because of the pandemic. If you ask me, it is the person who is directly affected, who is the expert on what they need to be done and how it needs to be done. And they have to be at the center of that entire action. And it's that simple. It is critical that we also understand that sustainable peace does not only mean the absence of war, but rather it also entails the absence of violence, the equal participation of all citizens, and the access to productive and economic resources. Despite all these challenges, young women are not passively sitting around waiting for change to happen around them. We have seen and experienced how women were the first responders during the pandemic, providing health support, as caretakers in the communities, and as social entrepreneurs when millions lost their jobs. I have witnessed young women's resilience firsthand. And this was before and during the pandemic. These are young women who were denied their childhood, who were married off as children, and who also in turn had children, who transformed their lives and that of other young women like them who were forced into a child marriage. These young women leveraged their capacity to begin earning their own livelihoods in order to emancipate themselves and other women from vicious cycles of poverty. Clearly, working together with and for young women has sustainable results, not only in their personal lives, but also at the national level, the regional, the international levels. Dear friends and colleagues, the time to engage with young women equally and meaningfully is now. It is not enough to talk about building back better and inclusive recovery when there are parts of the population that are excluded. We must be deliberate about it, involving young women in the planning stages, the implementation, and the monitoring of recovery strategies. We cannot say that we are leaving no one behind when the needs, the experiences, and the priorities of young women in developing communities are neglected. Sustainability grows from the bottom up. We need to move away from including young women as tokens and move into intergenerational power sharing and co-leadership. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that this is localized, with direct and more flexible funding allocated to young women's organizations. We clearly have the guiding frameworks already in place. It is now time for these commitments to be felt at the country level and in the communities, and especially by every young woman. The clock is ticking to achieve Agenda 2030. We have less than 10 years to go. Thank you very much once again for inviting me here today, and I look forward to the discussions. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Wanangwa, for these powerful words. I had goosebumps listening to you. I'm taking notes. I mean, sustainability grows from the bottom up. The clock is ticking. It's a call to action. Thank you for sharing this with us. I would next like to invite Rina, who will provide our second keynote speech, to the floor. Rina will be speaking on UN's zero tolerance policy towards sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Are these only words, or a tangible shared responsibility for sustainable peace? Thank you, Rina. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. And first of all, thank you for Wanangwa for these absolutely powerful words. Although we come from different corners of the world, I only echo your point on how important it is to encourage and empower young women, young girls from early on. And that's the only way we can build equitable and sustainable futures for us all. So thank you, that was absolutely powerful. I will touch upon something heavier, and I will start by stating 3 locations: the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Lebanon, and New York. What do these places have in common? Well, unfortunately, it is the reality, not an imagined one, that all of these locations have witnessed acts of sexual misconduct, whether it has been in the form of sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual harassment, abuse of power, or even rape. This, as I said, is not an imagined reality. As some of you might have seen this piece of news about a month ago about World Health Organization employees, so personnel of the UN, using sexual favors to employ people. And this report was recently published, and it brought extreme shame to not only the UN, WHO, but each and every person representing the UN, that this cannot simply be the reality of our feet on the ground. Of course, this doesn't include more than 1% or even less of the UN personnel, but it's something that absolutely is an unsustainable way to bring our agenda forward. Just to give you tangible examples, what do these scenarios include? Sexual harassment can take the form of unwanted sexualizing comments in the office, something that can be seen very casual between colleagues, but it can actually force some of our colleagues to relocate or even leave the UN. They might be the sharpest of minds, but just because there is sexual misconduct in the office, they might be forced to leave. This can also be, as mentioned in the Democratic Republic of the Congo case with the World Health Organization. This can take, sexual misconduct can take the form of forcing someone to sexual favors for employment. Now, what are the consequences of such actions, and why do we need to take this problem very seriously? If we look at the credibility of our operations, I've myself been a military peacekeeper in Lebanon, and what does our operation credibility look like in villages where some of our peacekeepers might engage in sexual relations with the local population? What happens to trust? Anyone can picture that in case we breach this code of conduct, there won't be any trust. What happens to partnerships that have been built over years, if not decades, by our predecessors in the UN, all blown up in the air just because of misconduct? I also wanted to highlight, just to make it even more tangible and something that touches our everyday lives, is that this type of sexual misconduct can take a form internally or externally. We might be internally harassing a colleague. We might be externally destroying our partnership. So it takes different shapes, different relations, but it can be everywhere and anywhere around us. But I don't want to leave us without solutions. I just wanted to highlight the seriousness of this issue and the reason why we need to take this so seriously. It's both an internal problem and an external one. First of all, I would like to highlight a couple of solutions. One of them being simply awareness. We're sitting here in this shared virtual space trying to find tangible solutions to problems that if they continue taking place, will not lead us towards sustainable peace and development. Awareness raising. But awareness raising doesn't happen on its own. We need to have consistent training. I myself, I've been a gender focal point in the UN peace operation in Lebanon, and I know what it means to train others on topics of the women, peace and security agenda that these people might have never heard about. But we need to be able and brave enough to really provide this training, to push for it, and to hold our supervisors accountable for offering these trainings. Just as a kind tip for, as we have a lot of UNVs currently online, the UNV headquarters capacity development team is actually currently providing capacity building workshops around prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So if you haven't yet done so, I highly and warmly recommend to take part in these 2-hour workshops that are very interactive, and you will have a lot of exchange of information and ideas. Last but not least, one of the solutions is clearly indicating reporting channels. As long as we know to whom to go to in case of sexual misconduct, we have a direction, we feel more safe, we feel less afraid of the fear of retaliation, for example.
Thank you, Rina, for sharing your real lived on the ground experience of a topic that's incredibly difficult to navigate. And I think you did so incredibly eloquently and honestly. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I think this is something we will move into later in our discussions. So now I would like us to move into a Q&A with our panelists. So I will ask them some questions and let's kind of see how this discussion can flow, and please feel free to share your thoughts, your responses, any questions you might have in the chat, and we will move to an audience Q&A towards the end of our hour. So Victoria, I would really like to come to you first and just ask firstly that you can kind of tell us a little bit more about what your typical day looks like. What does your day-to-day role look like working for UNFPA as a gender-based violence international specialist? Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Busy, firstly. The role is incredibly diverse. It is largely centered around programmatic implementation, and that involves providing substantive and technical advice to government mainly. I am residing currently in Laos, which, as you may or may not know, is a communist country. So a lot of our implementing partners are government ministries. For me, it's Lao Women's Union. So it's a lot of technical and substantive advice, but it also involves some humanitarian and emergency responses, particularly in the current COVID context. And there's also quite regular flooding in the southern parts of Laos that we need to be prepared for. So providing technical advice essentially usually takes, you take the international standards on GBV prevention and response and you localize it to the country context. So, for example, I provided technical support to the development of 2 national action plans on gender equality and gender-based violence or ending violence against women. I have experience in running national hotlines and case management of GBV incidents. So I might provide recommendations to Lao Women's Union protection shelters and on how to improve service delivery or how to ethically collect data. And provide capacity building for mental health and psychosocial support, for example. Recently, with the floods, I drafted a rapid assessment tool that's gender responsive for use in post-emergency contexts. Because we have floods quite commonly here, as I mentioned before, we found that disaggregated data was not being collected sufficiently and the needs of women and girls was not being collected at all. So I developed that, and then we advocated for Lao Women's Union to be allowed to travel to the flood affected areas and use this rapid assessment tool. But what I just wanted to point out that what I've just been describing sounds a lot like top-down approaches, which I think is what people view sometimes at what UN staff do, unless you're in the field. And I think when Wenangwa, you mentioned how important it was to have these bottom-up approaches and how nothing will get done if we don't. So I wanted to flag that my role does entail things that would be considered bottom-up as well. So for example, I contributed to and then monitored the rollout of a manual we developed that engages males at the village level. We get male village elders on board who are respected and carry gravitas in the communities and the villages. We teach them about the prevention of violence against women, about gender equality, sharing household chores, sharing caring for the children. And then once they learn that, they teach the males in the village. So I think it's really important that we do combine and complement those top-down and bottom-up approaches.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Fascinating to get an insight into your incredibly diverse and busy day. And I think you've touched on something really important, not only in top-down and bottom-up approaches, but also engaging men. And yes, I think we're going to come back to that a little more later on. But next, Jiandira, I'd like to come to you. I've been so fascinated researching all of your incredible work, and Jiandira was actually the main lawyer for the Gender Unite of the Supreme Electoral Court during the process of departmental, regional and municipal elections. So, I mean, that's quite an achievement. And I kind of wanted to ask you, what would you say were some of your proudest achievements during that time?
Thank you, Catherine. Well, I will talk about Bolivia. Bolivia has faced a long and complex electoral process since 2019. In 2020, we have witnessed a historical milestone regarding parity. Since then, currently, we occupy the 3rd place in the world with the highest parliamentary political participation. Our assembly has 49% female representation. In 2020, this year, although parity was achieved, There was also an increase of political violence at various levels during the subnational process. The gender unit of the Supreme Electoral Court attended more than 25 women who suffered political violence situation. For example, pressure to resign their nomination or prevent women from running for political position. Legal attention, it's a sensitive issue that puts you in direct contact with the victims and the challenge women face. In response to your question, Kat, what my proudest achievement is, I would say the unit obtained the first sentence for harassment and political violence in Bolivia in electoral process. It means that a political organization was sanctioned for attempting to prevent a councilwoman from assuming the position she had won by majority in her community. Also, through the technical support provided by UN Women, we incorporate assistance process and a complaint line that is still in the gender unit. Also, my favorite part will be that we promote as well dialogues and meetings for women to learn about the national and international normative framework that protect their political rights. And we have also worked on a mechanism for the political violence prevention, which has made this crime more visible, especially in the rural areas and the community. I would say that 2020 and 2021, these two electoral processes have been a democratic achievement with the participation of more than 87% of the voters despite the pandemic. So that was a very big deal here in Bolivia as well in the region. And I will finish saying that parity democracy has been strengthened and has made visible the need to improve the structure for the reporting and violence prevention in Bolivian state. That will be it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yandira, and congratulations on what you're changing the landscape of Bolivian political electorate. So well done, and congratulations on that. Wanangwa, I would like to come to you next because I know that you worked with the UN Office for the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, and you were focusing on gender equality and meaningful youth engagement and inclusion across all of the UN pillars. And I think, I don't know about you, but we talk a lot at the minute about young people as leaders of tomorrow. This is a phrase I hear all the time, they're leaders of tomorrow. But you spoke so eloquently in your keynote speech about how we need to recognize young people as leaders of today. So how do we rightly recognize and celebrate young people right now as being the change makers and leaders that they are?
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think, as I also touched upon earlier in my keynote address, it is that young people are already leading and bringing about innovative solutions, whether it's in rural or urban contexts. But however, they're still facing challenges when it comes to accessing their rights, productive resources, and even in influencing decisions. So in order to celebrate young people as change makers of today, we must create favorable conditions and an environment that allows young people to be engaged. And this can be done through dialogue platforms, through creating quotas for young people in different institutions in order to inform and influence policies, and through intergenerational power sharing. And as a result of this, we are going to move from youth participation to youth engagement. And this is where now the co-leadership and the co-ownership of decisions comes about. And beyond this, we need to be accountable to young people. And I think accountability was also raised by Irina. And the same as well with young people, we need to be accountable. And this builds that trust between young people and the different institutions that are there. And through my work, I've actually found that scorecards are a very effective tool for young people to be able to provide feedback to the different duty bearers. And capacity building as well is key. I mean, yes, young people need capacity building, but I think we also need to shift our thinking when it comes to capacity building. And I think something that came out quite clearly to me during my work with the UN Youth Envoy's office is that sometimes it is not the capacity of youth that needs to be built, but rather it is the capacity of the development partners, of the institutions, of the systems on how they should work best with and for young people. And this is what is very crucial in creating that effective relationship and different partnerships with young people to be able to create change in this present day. Back to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Mnangagwa, for this eloquent response. I'm moving across now, and I'm sorry I'm not giving attention that I want to all of your answers, but I want us to have time to discuss further. So I'm moving across now to Rina, who is working in peacekeeping and peace building and has had quite a different experience in some ways to some of us on this call. And I think we know that peacekeeping, peace building are traditionally male dominated fields. We're talking about this. We've got initiatives such as the ELSI initiative, which are trying to change this. Could you tell us a bit about your work when you're working as a gender security training associate, and what does this look like, and perhaps share for some people who might be here and not be so familiar with what this world looks like, being traditionally male dominated? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So gender security training associate, I would break it down to 3 pillars around which I've focused. The first being training our fellow gender focal points in the UN system. So in my case, that would have meant gathering all the gender focal points in UN agencies in Egypt, where I'm currently working, and going over what the gender focal point role really means. And it's very different from working as a gender focal point in a military peacekeeping operation, as was my case previously, into or comparing that military context to a more civilian context. Talking about the role of a gender focal point being a bridge between the UN personnel and the appropriate security authorities or whoever will take care of the cases later on. So really working as that bridge. For the gender focal points, what is really important is that they are aware of their roles and responsibilities, how to respond with empathy, how to report effectively, for example. Secondly, a big aspect of our work, of my work as a gender security associate, has been UNDP's women's security awareness trainings for the Arab states region. It's a huge challenge, and it's a huge adventure to be on, trying to cover country-specific security threats, to review the training material for the training material to match each context. And perhaps most finally and most excitedly, we just published in January 2021 a booklet on navigating personal safety and security in Egypt, with very, very tangible tips for UN personnel and dependents on how to navigate personal safety and security living in Egypt and working for the UN. And doing this in collaboration with other UN funds and programs was absolutely interesting, and definitely a learning experience for myself as well. That's all, Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Rina. I'm moving across now to you, Victoria, and to go in a little more detail into your work as a gender-based violence specialist. And I mean, of course, I'm sure we're all aware that the coronavirus pandemic saw gender-based violence rates absolutely soar. And I wanted to ask you to share some insights on possibly any reasons for why this may have been the case, and also a little bit about what the impact of that has been on your work, given that this is in your line of duty. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so I think it's well established globally. All the evidence indicates that the risk of violence against women increases during lockdown, quarantines, isolations, any restrictions on movement. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence in particular can increase. And it's purely for worries about money, worries about job, health, insecurity, uncertainty. It heightens tensions in the household. And then that's made worse by everyone being cramped and confined to one household. And then further to this, COVID has had a huge and adverse impact on the economy, individually as well as on the country level. And so anytime there's any kind of economic downturn or economic insecurity, we see a rise in sexual exploitation, child marriage, and human trafficking or trafficking in persons. Anything that brings money into the household, very unfortunately at the expense of usually women and usually adolescent girls. And so Laos, where I'm currently serving, is no exception to these global trends. We've got hotline data from Lao Women's Union, which, as I mentioned before, is our implementing partner, showing significant spikes and significant increases in the number of hotline calls every time there is a strict lockdown imposed, which we've been going in and out of lockdowns here. And the types of concerns that are being raised are concerns of child sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and physical violence in domestic settings in the households. And then unfortunately what we're seeing is, whilst we're seeing increases of GBV, at the same time we're seeing major disruptions to GBV services. So entry points that used to be available to women or to people who survivors of violence are no longer available or accessible. Restrictions on movement mean that, you know, if you used to go to see a midwife quite routinely to have maternal care, quite often midwives and medical professionals are frontline responders, and people often end up disclosing violence through a routine medical exam. And a lot of these services have been stopped or disrupted. And then of course, in some cases, survivors are confined to the spaces at home in direct contact with their perpetrators. So if you think of sexual abuse that's perpetrated by a relative, for example, which we actually see a lot of in Laos. So in terms of how this has impacted my work, which is the second part of your question, Catherine. So immediately we had to scale up provision of remote mental health and psychosocial support and counselling, which is predominantly provided through hotlines. We expanded that immediately to be operating 24/7. And then trained the staff on how to provide psychological first aid. We then advocated for GBV services to be declared essential by the government. So that meant that staff and survivors were not restricted during lockdowns. They could move to get to services. I was instrumental in activating an interagency kind of coordination mechanism on gender and GBV. So it meant that we weren't all duplicating services and trying to go to the same places. And then once restrictions lift, and we're currently in lockdown here in Laos, I'll be traveling to quarantine centres for returning migrants to ensure that the centres are safe for women and girls, sorry. So is there enough lighting? Are there locks on the doors? Are the bathrooms sex segregated? That type of thing. So lots of changes, but also in some ways, business as usual.
Thank you, Victoria. That's incredibly illuminating. Giantira, I'm coming over to you next and coming back to the political arena. Genuine progress has been made over recent years regarding women's political participation. We know that, we see that. However, I was reading a recent Council of Europe report which found that many minority groups have not seen the effects of these changes. And I wanted to ask, what do you think are the biggest challenges to the participation of all women in politics?
Thank you, Catherine. Well, in politics, despite the progress made, women's exclusion persists in decision-making at various levels, such as generating of public policy, creating regulation, or work budget allocation. Such exclusion or non-acceptance generates lacks dialogue and approach with women who represent half of the population. This is further deepened by the intersectionality in which we observe that this group are even more invisible and marginalized. The asymmetry is presented by the mechanism of discrimination, gender stereotypes, and harmful masculinities. Gender stereotypes and roles still do not allow us to conceive women with enough capacities to occupy political spaces. On the other hand, the lack of access to education, the situation of the burden care at home make it more difficult for them to participate on equal terms. Another discrimination issues, for example, are language difficulties, level of their education, or ethnic and class background. Saying this, we must address this challenge in all areas. For example, within a political organization that must bet on women profiles not only for parity, but effectively to ensure that they reflect the real interests and the needs they have. Likewise, we must work with the voters to eliminate this imaginary that women do not have the capacity to make decisions because they are fragile, weak, emotional. Also, it is important to promote a more democratic culture in educational space. School, universities, youth groups, and associations, in which the leadership of women and groups are conceived as essential for democratic process. Finally, implement the mechanism to prevent political violence, making it visible as a form of gender violence that threats parity and women's political rights. I think I will say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Giandira. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about how men should be engaged more in lots of what we're talking about, which is incredibly important, and actually is something I wanted to talk to you, Wanangwa, about, because I know that you do quite some work in championing male engagement, particularly in support of promoting education and economic empowerment with a gender lens. So perhaps you could talk to us about this and answer some of these questions that are also arising in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think, as has been rightly said, the issues that we're dealing with, they're really embedded in a lot of societal dynamics, as well as the different cultural and social norms that are there. So it is critical that we understand who the decision makers are in the community. How do they influence these decisions? So when we're talking about male engagement, it's a powerful instrument that we can use whenever we want to shift gender norms and across different development pillars, and specifically as well in societies where men are often the key decision makers, which has also been the case in my experience. So thereby, by engaging them, we move from engagement to societal behavior change. So the process of this is to identify and orient male champions, men that are influential, that are leaders, and who can become positive role models to other men, boys, women, girls, and all genders within that community, in order to build a supportive environment. And in this case, maybe we're talking about girls' education, women economic empowerment, and even in terms of reducing gender-based violence. So we have seen even a growing number of women's cooperatives over the decades, women who still continue to face even discrimination and sometimes gender-based violence, as was also raised by Victoria, that it has skyrocketed during the pandemic. So now we can use the male champions, we can engage with them to advocate for greater social acceptance, firstly, for example, of women's income generation. In terms of GBV, we can engage male champions to talk about the impacts and the effects of gender-based violence, the rights of the specific women that are undergoing and that are survivors of the gender-based violence. And this is also utilized in different contexts, whether we're talking about education. And this is the same concept where, for example, in education, we have seen that transition and completion rates of different girls and boys in different contexts has still been lower than that of boys. So it's the same concept that male champions now come in, and they are crucial for this, to be able to hold discussions with the communities on the inequalities that are happening, the implications, and to address the social deterrents, for example, of education, or how best to address gender-based violence. So it creates that social acceptance into saying we need to take a step back and reevaluate what the impact of what we're doing is in order to move into a societal behavior change. So that is the main concept around male engagement. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you for this one, Angua. Rena, I'm going to loop back to you, noting that we're now, almost to the day, 21 years since Resolution 1325. I want to ask you, if you could summarize this briefly, what are some of the biggest changes you have seen in your time as a peacekeeper, and where do you think we should be in the next 20 years?
Thank you, Catherine. I will keep it short and sweet. I would like to highlight one tangible initiative. I will not pretend like I know the whole time frame from 2000 to 2021, as I was 8 years old back then. I can talk about an initiative that started in 2017. You, Catherine, already mentioned it in the beginning of the webinar. It's called the ELSI Initiative Fund. It was originally launched by the government of Canada, and currently we have a handful of donors. What this fund is really about, it is looking for solutions for creative incentives and encouragement for peacekeeping, peacekeeping countries that are contributing their troops to peacekeeping operations to engage more women. In this ELSI Initiative Fund, they are receiving ideas of nations, how these nations could encourage, could increase their amount of women serving in peace operations. And all of this is backed with the data that we simply, on the field, on the ground, we simply have better access to women, to girls and boys of societies, given that we, as women, just based on our gender, no matter how good the intentions of our male colleagues are, we just simply, we're able to talk to women, we're able to talk to children, and as a consequence, we have more information of what is happening in the society. I've experienced that firsthand as a peacekeeper, and being able to talk to local high school girls about their wishes and dreams as we were visiting a Muslim Lebanese community. So to bring this to a larger scheme of things, this ELSI Initiative Fund is just one government-led initiative that can really bring tangible change. Again, this is not just words, this is actual funding for countries that are willing to try to engage more women in meaningful peace operation roles. That will be all from my side, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Rena. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question I would like to ask to Victoria before we move to a quick audience Q&A. Victoria, you mentioned that you've been working in mental health, and you also mentioned you specialize in disability inclusion. And I think it's really important that we can have an intersectional conversation when we talk about gender. I wondered if you could just talk to us about possibly how COVID may have impacted the intersectional experiences of women with disabilities who are then subject to violence, and what can be done to address this. If you could just touch on this for us, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so look, I spoke before about women and girls being confined to homes and cut off from GBV services. So they're already at an increased risk of GBV. And then this increased risk of violence in times of emergency is then compounded for those with disabilities. So they have additional risk factors that potentially make them more vulnerable to abuse. So for example, intimate partners, because support services have been cut off, they may have to take on new caregiving responsibilities, and that can create tension. Services that were provided, GBV services that were provided and are now being provided through alternative modalities, that information hasn't been shared in accessible formats. So women and girls with disabilities don't know who to turn to in the event that they do experience violence. Or sometimes people perceive women and girls with disabilities to be weak or an easy target. They're constantly subject to stigma and discrimination and marginalisation at the best of times, let alone in the current COVID times that we live in, or in emergency contexts. And so during lockdowns or mandatory isolation, women and girls with disabilities are even less able to escape and seek help for violence, and that also brings to mind communication barriers as well when they do try to seek help. So it's really critical that any COVID and GBV related interventions take into account that intersectional experience of women and girls with disabilities. So just for example, we were working with Lao Women's Union to establish alternative contact modalities. Before it was just walk-in and good old landline. And so we worked with Lao Women's Union to create this alternative WhatsApp, which I'm sure you're all familiar with WhatsApp, but if you're not, it's an encrypted messaging platform. But it does mean that those with hearing impairments or those who are non-verbal that are trapped inside a house with their abuser can contact the protection shelters. We've also partnered with a CSO, for example, to produce videos communicated in sign language that speak to, like Rena, you were speaking to earlier, PSEA, Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse by aid workers, and also sensitize them to broader issues around sexual harassment and sexual and gender-based violence. So the idea is to mainstream disability inclusion into all our GBV and COVID-related interventions, as well as have targeted interventions for women and girls with disability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Okay, I mean, we have very limited time left, but I'd love to get in one of our audience questions at least. And I'm looking at this question, which has come from, can't see the name, but it says that in most where I have worked, I have noticed that the country culture has been an overwhelming challenge in the fight of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse. How can we overcome this cultural challenge, since the culture is not something movable easily? It's a brilliant question. Perhaps if I go first to, yes, I'll start with you, Giantira. I'll ask you all to just respond to this cultural question very, very briefly, if you can. Thank you. Giantira, I will start with you.
Maybe I can say that we have to understand our context that we are going through. For example, knowing that the pandemic has brought important lessons, at this time it made more visible the large digital gaps between men and women. As well, we see the increase of the burden care, the unbalanced organization at home. So I think it will be important to see that we must take a stand in supporting and strengthening leadership capacities in women and girls, especially in my area. For example, I'm talking about the political sphere, because we must work with women and girls as well. We have to work with positive masculinities with men and boys as well. As I talk, I refer the discrimination issue, the role, the stereotypes. So it is important as well. It is essential that this space of opportunity that we provide to girls and women have to be adapted to their realities and social cultural context. Meaning, for example, providing mechanisms that allow them to manage their care roles, providing direct access to education and information. And I think it's very important as well. We have to do an advocacy with the media to make them more visible in leadership spaces. No? In my area, I will talk about the political and participation field, but it's important, this work with youth and political spaces. It is important. We should, for example, address it not only when we have an electoral process in our countries, for example, but all the time the awareness on human rights, gender equality, and peace culture. I will say that. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Wanangwa, could I ask you to answer this next, please, this culture question? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think it also comes back to what I was talking about as well with male engagement. And just to go further from that, we need to build awareness. I think awareness was touched upon as well by some of my colleagues. We need to build awareness of everybody in the community of what the impacts are of the specific gender-based violations that we're talking about. And I think something that is crucial is that we need a coordinated response to that of essential as well as of social services. So the judiciary, the police, we're talking about social workers, and they need to be able to know that they can access these services and they have to be coordinated. And I think Rina mentioned something about SEA initially. For example, if there's sort of a rape or something that falls into that line, that there's medical assistance that is required from there has to be that coordinated response with the health and the police, that they can be able to actually have evidence and to bring that to judiciary systems. And going further than that, we need to integrate issues of gender-based violence, issues of sexual reproductive health and rights right in the schools. And I think remotely, providing that during this COVID times, was also mentioned by Victoria, and that's something that we cannot take lightly. So this has to be integrated right from the school, that everybody is aware as they're going into the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanangwa. Rina, could you share with us your brief thoughts on this? Thank you.
Thanks. My 2 words will be research. We need data to show the impact of, for example, deploying more women in peacekeeping. Secondly, we need to lead by example. If people never see different ways of behavior, different ways of leading, systems will not change. So data and an example, short and sweet. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. And finally, Victoria, over to you.
Great question, the $1 million question. I'm going to keep mine very short as well. And I am reflecting on the 3 countries that I've predominantly worked in. And I've thought about the major agents of change in each country. And each country is different. As I was talking about in Laos, it's the village elders who are, once you get them on board, and you teach them about prevention of GBV, then you've got the whole village on board. In my home country, Australia, it's youth. It is the fantastic work. You may have read that, youth are taking things to the High Court. They're taking things to the UN. They're the ones that are actually shaking things up. And from working in Bangladesh, I'd say when we got the faith leaders on board, because faith is such a huge part of the Islamic country that is Bangladesh, that once you had them on board, it was a lot easier to make changes at a variety of different levels. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you all, distinguished colleagues. We are out of time. I'm heartbroken. I feel as though we could have gone on forever, another hour at least. I have so much more I want to talk to you about, but for now I will just thank you all for your time, for sharing your insights, your experience, your wisdom. It has been an absolute pleasure to discuss with you and to hear how you've been able to navigate so many different topics in such a short space of time. I thank you for that. To all of those who've given up their time to join us this afternoon, thank you. We will follow up with you shortly, and I will see if we can get some of the questions in the chat we didn't get time to get around to. Perhaps we can see if our panelists might kindly share a few words and thoughts on them with you via email. So please watch this space. This is the second in a series. We will have a third coming up, so please stay in touch and take care. Thank you very much for your time today. Bye-bye.